So personal question, how do you live your faith? And how do you live the personal question? Good.
Well, let me just say that when I was young, I kind of kept a little quiet among my professors or people, not among my friends, my classmates. I'm not necessarily recommending that. As a faculty member, I'm at a university that's not a religious university. So, but I do have, in my office, I have a crucifix on the wall. So all the students, I mostly taught. I retired last month, but I mostly taught grad students. But I didn't have to tell them. They saw the crucifix, and the word gets out, and so the students all know I'm religious. And occasionally, students come in and talk to me. Not that often, but sometimes students were either religious or not religious. Sometimes Muslim students who are religious or not, or Christians or whatever, and they've come and talked to me about religion. So I don't hide it, but I don't talk about it in class because I'm there to teach physics and not to teach anything else. So I guess that's all I'll say about that.
Jenny, what would you say?
Well, my context is a bit different because I do teach at a Catholic university, and I'm one of 3 theologians in an interdisciplinary department, and so my job really is to talk about faith. I mean, so there's a sort of difference in the university context between theology and like religious studies, and at a place like Notre Dame, we do theology, which we borrow the sort of famous line from Anselm, which is faith seeking understanding, right? So faith is kind of presumed as our starting point. What I do try to do, I'm very transparent, I think, in the university classroom about my own sort of faith, but what I do try to do is, because not all of my students are Catholic, not all of my students are religious, so I do try to present, here's the sort of strongest possible version of this claim, and here's the strongest possible version of this one, and just to kind of create, I think what's more important than sort of giving information about it is to create a sort of democratic and loving relationship and environment where everyone feels respected and able to weigh in on these kind of religious questions, which can be pretty fraught, I think, for a lot of students, for sure. Thank you for your question.
Well, we are characters in God's story, but God is a rather different kind of author, because if I were to write a story, I could write a story about a person who made decisions or who loved or who acted freely, but that would just be a character that I imagined acted freely or I imagined loved, but not God writes a story in which the characters actually are alive, actually have free will, actually love. So we can't create, the human author can only create simulacra, can only create representations of those things or characters that are imagined to be alive or imagined to love. God actually creates real characters who have real free will and autonomy and really love and really live, and that's why he's God and we're not. So only God really creates. I mean, in Catholic theology, we say an artist creates, but in the theological sense of create, only God creates. We don't really create. No creature can create in the sense that God creates.
Jenny, did you have any?
Well, just to kind of echo on just the last thing that Steve said, it is, so this idea of creation from nothing, like what God does, in JP2's letter to artists, he does make the distinction between the creator and the craftsman. And so I'd really encourage those of you who are interested in this question of creativity to look at John Paul II's letter to artists, where he really does talk a lot more about the creative impulse. And he does make that distinction between being able to create something out of nothing, which is not what we do when we exercise the creative impulse, but we craft from what we already have, right? We're not sort of creating something with a new ontological status like God does, which is just a sort of underscoring what Steve is saying in a different idiom.
Can I take a crack at that? So a couple of things. There are a couple of things packed in there. So first of all, I just want to say, so there are some atheist scientists who say the universe is cold, blind, impersonal, doesn't care about us, and that is true. The universe is cold, blind, impersonal, doesn't care about us. But of course, that's because God and the universe aren't the same thing. So the universe doesn't give a darn about us, whether we live or die, but God does. Now, there's another question. I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but some people look at the size of the universe, the vastness of it, and say, how can we amount to a hill of beans? How can we be important? If God created this whole universe, and we're just this tiny, infinitesimal speck in this universe, how can we be important in the cosmic scheme? That's ridiculous. But I'll just tell you a little fun physics fact that actually turns that around a little bit. And by the way, famous atheists, and it's not just atheists, Christian believers have worried about this. In the Psalm, what is man that that you care about him? When I behold the moon, the work of your fingers and so forth, why do you care about man? It turns out that if you have laws of physics that are somewhat like the ones we have, and you want to have a universe with living things in it that develop naturally, the universe has to be very, very old and has to be very, very big. And so, for example, it took billions of years for life to start from a single-celled organism to get all the way to us. Even before life began, it took billions of years to synthesize the chemicals of the periodic table through astrophysical processes. So billions of years of cosmic evolution to get the elements, billions more to get from the elements to get to advanced organisms. So you need a universe to last billions of years. It turns out that given the laws of gravity, that there's a relationship between how big the universe gets, how big the maximum size it gets, and how long it lasts. So suppose somebody said, if we're really important in the cosmic scheme, God shouldn't have created all that empty, wasted space. He should have just created a universe of human scale, right? And so let's say a universe the size of North America, say. Such a universe, if the universe never got bigger than that, would have lasted about 1/100 of a second. Even if God created the universe and said it shouldn't get any bigger than the solar system, which is still inconceivably vast compared to us, it would have only lasted a few hours. If you want a universe that's going to last the billions of years that it takes to produce us, it has to be at least as big as it is. So the vastness of the universe and its antiquity, its vast age, are preconditions for us being here. So I would say you could just as easily make the argument that they point to us and our significance as saying that this shows that we don't matter. Just a little physics.
There may be a sort of Christological kind of answer to the question too. I mean, we think about God being so transcendent and creating this sort of, expanding universe that, as Steve's talking about. But then we also think about, God in the flesh as the most vulnerable thing there is, right? A little human baby, defenseless, all those kinds of things. So in Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity, I really should have brought copies to sell. I feel like I'm really hawking that book today. But he talks about God as the paradox of the maximum and the minimum, right? The biggest, sort of most transcendent, but also the most vulnerable and delicate. God, creator of the universe, becoming manifest in the world as a baby, right? The smallest thing you can think, right? So, I think there's multiple ways of addressing your very good question.
When you think about it, it's kind of strange that God created anything, because God is infinitely greater than anything he might create. So why wasn't he just satisfied loving himself? But he condescended to create us, who are nothing but grains of sand in comparison to him, and loving us and dying for us. And that's the whole Christian paradox, is that he cared about, we're supposed to care about the least of our brethren, right? So So you have both in the universe. Actually, Chris Bagler writes about this very well. You don't want you need sort of both. If you want to have the universe be an arena of free and responsible agents, if you had a universe that was just order, everything marching in lockstep, so that everything that happened followed rigidly from some formula, you're not going to have a world in which you can have free and responsible agents. So you need to have a certain amount of disorder in the world, a certain amount of randomness. What is randomness? Randomness is, this is discussed by Aristotle, also St. Thomas Aquinas. They talk about chance. You have to have a world in which chance things happen, because suppose all of us are free, and so each of us is doing our thing, and what I do and what you do and what you do are not aligned and correlated, and they all are independent of each other. And so when you have a lot of things acting independently, you get chance events. That's what chance is. If I go to Main Street to post a letter at the post office, you go to Main Street to buy something at the store. We have our own storylines. They're not connected to each other. And we run into each other on the street. Well, that's a chance event because our paths intersect. So you need to have, if you're going to have a world where there's room for freedom and responsibility and so on, you can't have it just be rigidly controlled and completely ordered. Otherwise, you just have machines. Okay, this ties into to what Jen was saying in her talk. And so there's a very interesting fact about the history of physics that has been pointed out by physicists in the past. It's a very well-known fact. It turns out that mathematicians, pure mathematicians aren't that interested in whether the math they're working on has any applications to anything. They're interested in it just for its elegance, its mathematical beauty and interest. And it turns out that a lot of mathematics that was developed over the years, over the centuries, by mathematicians only because it was mathematically beautiful, elegant, interesting, without any thought of its being applied to anything. And in fact, mathematics that looked like it could have no application to the physical world turned out later, sometimes a century later, to be mathematics that you need to describe the physical world. There are many examples of this. So I don't know how many of you know about complex numbers or square root of -1 and so on. So all of complex analysis, as it's called, a lot of it was developed in the 1830s. Beautiful mathematics seemed to be totally useless. Later, it was found out 100 years later, you need it for quantum mechanics. You can't write down the laws of quantum mechanics without it. And there are many such examples where math that was now, you might say, well, don't we regard our physics theories as beautiful out of vanity? I come up with a theory. This actually does happen, and I've come up with theories and models, and I really love them. In fact, I remember going home and I said to my wife, I had cooked up a model in the physics sense of quarks and leptons, these are kinds of particles, and I thought it was a beautiful model. I went home and I said to my wife, I have this really beautiful model. And my daughter, Elizabeth, who was like 10, she said, Poppy, because she thought I meant a beautiful model like a supermodel. Anyway, so we do think our models are beautiful, partly because we thought them up. And so we're very, vanity. But an argument that that's not entirely the case is that a lot of the math that's used in fundamental physics was thought up by the mathematicians when it was thought to be completely useless, only because they worked on it only because it was mathematically elegant, as they say. Later, we find that's what's used to build this universe.
From my end of things, do you guys remember maybe, 3 or 4, maybe 5 years ago when the internet kind of broke because the dress, everyone thought it's white and gold. Oh no, it's black and blue. Remember this? This is maybe an example of kind of what you're talking about, like how much of what we see is with us and the sort of cones and rods in our eyes and the sort of way our computer screens are adjusted for color and that kind of thing. And what could account for the fact that something that is objectively one color or another, it was a black and it was black and blue, right? Yeah, it was a black and blue dress, appeared white and gold to like half of the population, and then people were just fighting about it. So, I think what I would say from a sort of like optical and aesthetic point of view is that you really do have to, it is a kind of a cooperative phenomenon, right? I mean, when you, but that does not mean you are projecting beauty into the thing. I mean, the thing itself may have inherent beauty, and that can be connected with any of the things that we talked about, symmetry or order or proportion or a fluidity of line or a brightness of color or any of those kinds of things. But, from a theologian's point of view, as a human subject, you are such that you are because God has given you and structured your sort of subjectivity and your mind and your perceptive abilities and all of those kinds of ways to recognize beauty and to see beauty in things that might not otherwise be like obviously beautiful. So, I mean, I really do think we ought not think that we infect the process. You know what I mean? Like, just the human touch isn't a drawback. It's this kind of cooperative moment in which we as human subjects oriented to the goodness and truth and beauty of God are able to recognize in the world things that are participating in the goodness and truth and beauty of God. And so it's not just that we're making it up or relativizing it. We're doing what we're supposed to do, I think. So I think that's a good way of thinking of it. It's more cooperatively than antagonistically.